The snow began before dawn, thin as sifted flour over the brittle plains. It did not fall in flurries or drifts, but in quiet, deliberate flakes, as if the sky itself knew to step softly on this morning. The town of Eden Hollow, little more than a dozen wooden buildings nailed against the wind, stirred with uneasy silence. Fires burned low, not for warmth, but for comfort. Folks kept their coats on indoors. She stood still as a tombstone in the churchyard, gray cloak clasped at her throat, veil drawn down like mourning. Evelyn May had buried one husband in the summer, a soldier in a uniform too clean for the blood it met, and now she was to marry again, not for love nor comfort, but for peace. The preacher's words were slow, cracked with frost and disuse. The gathered crowd said nothing. No songs, no flowers, no cheers. This was not a wedding of joy, but of politics and consequence, a threadbare ceremony meant to hold back the edge of war. Across from her stood the Comanche chief, tall, shoulders straight as pine. His hair was braided, his face painted not for war, but honor. He did not reach for her hand. He did not smile. His name was Tahoma, and the silence between them was thick as winter bark. The treaty had failed, the settlers' promises hollow, and the Comanche patience thinning. Land disputes had turned to blood. Evelyn's husband had been among the first to die, though few in town mourned him long. He'd been proud, loud, quick to judge, slow to love. She had wept for the idea of him more than the man. When the last parley nearly crumbled, Tahoma offered a solution no one expected: a marriage. One woman from the settlers, one man from the Comanche, joined to stop the blood before it soaked into spring. Evelyn had watched the faces of the men around her, eyes turning everywhere but toward her. Then came the silence that sealed her fate. She stepped forward, not out of valor, not out of faith, just stillness. The kind that comes after too much grief, the kind that makes surrender seem like peace. They called her brave. She heard it like a funeral bell. Now, as she stood before the preacher with Tahoma's shadow brushing hers, Evelyn found herself wondering if her heart still beat the same. The snow gathered on her veil. It looked like pearls from far away. She thought bitterly. Her mother would have loved the poetry of it all. The preacher raised his voice slightly, enough to be heard over the wind that whispered through the door's cracks. He said words like unity and agreement. Not once did he say love. Tahoma watched her with the gaze of someone who sees the storm and does not flinch. His eyes were dark, but not cold, not empty. She realized he was younger than she thought, maybe not yet 40. His face was lined not with age, but with the weight of leadership. When the final word was spoken, no one clapped. A few nodded, grim as executioners. Evelyn stepped down from the church porch and into the snow. Her boots left neat prints behind. Tahoma followed at a respectful distance. They did not speak. By evening, she was gone from Eden Hollow. No one stopped her. No one wept. A girl handed her a wrapped loaf of bread. That was the only kindness given. The wagon that carried her out was old but clean, driven by a Comanche scout who looked no older than 20. He nodded to her, but said nothing. There was a horse tethered for her, but she had not ridden since childhood, and the numbness in her limbs begged her to sit. The town faded behind them like a memory too tired to hold shape. She did not turn to look back. The plains opened before them, a canvas of white and gray, painted with the bare black spines of winter trees. The sky hung low and colorless. Even the birds were quiet. The silence was not cruel, not like the silence she had known in her house after her husband died. That had been the silence of judgment, of absence, of neighbors whispering through walls too thin for mercy. This was different. This silence breathed. It made space. They traveled until the sun sagged like a dying lantern. A small camp waited among the hills. Tents of hide and wood, smoke curling from low fires. Children ran like shadows between the shelters. An elder woman stirred a pot over the flame and looked up as Evelyn dismounted, her knees trembling slightly from the cold. Tahoma stood beside her now, still not touching, still not demanding. He said something in Comanche, a word she could not hold long enough to understand. But the elder woman smiled and approached. She was called Wapin, and though Evelyn did not understand her speech, the warmth in her eyes needed no translation. They gave her a tent. It smelled of cedar and smoke. Inside, a blanket waited, folded with care. A bowl of something hot sat on a wooden dish. She sat on the edge of the sleeping mat and removed her gloves slowly, as if unsure her hands were hers. Tahoma came to the doorway before night fully fell. He spoke just once. "This is your place now. No one will command you. I will not come in unless you ask." He left then, not looking back. She sat in the tent long after the fire outside had died down. Snow hissed on the canvas above her, faint and steady. She lay down, unsure what to pray for, unsure who still listened. Outside, the wind carried the language of another world. And inside her chest, something deep and old stirred. Not fear, not quite sorrow. Just the quiet echo of a heart learning how to listen again. In the distance, a coyote called to the dark. It was answered not by fear, but by another voice, soft, low, and almost tender. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since summer, she slept without dreams. The days passed without names. Evelyn woke to pale light seeping through hide, the scent of smoke and snow braided into each breath. There were no bells to mark the hours, no shutters to open, no porch to sweep. Only sky above and earth below. And silence, not from emptiness, but from a people who didn't waste words when glances and gestures held enough. The Comanche camp was tucked in a winter valley where the hills rose like frozen waves. Tents arranged in quiet order, smoke curling from each as if from hearts of intention. Life moved with rhythm here, slower, deliberate. It was not the rigid pace of settlers clocking time in ledgers, but the steady pulse of fire tenders, hunters, women drawing water from the creek without complaint. Evelyn was not expected to join them, not yet. She was not treated as guest nor captive, only observed, a figure of curiosity, but not fear. She wandered the camp's edges like a child tracing the outlines of a book she couldn't read. They gave her space, and somehow that was kinder than the questions she'd once been asked by townsfolk, questions pretending to be care, really just veiled judgment. Her tent stood near Tahoma's, but not beside it. He never entered nor called for her. Some nights, she saw him sitting by the largest fire, surrounded by men and women who deferred to him with natural ease. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, heads leaned closer. Evelyn couldn't understand the language, but she felt its cadence, smooth, dignified, worn like riverstone. She wondered what he had sacrificed for peace. Her own name still sounded strange to her, as if it belonged to another life. Evelyn May, widow, treaty bride. Some days she didn't speak it at all. There was no one here who used it, though the older woman, Wapin, had begun calling her something that sounded like Siawi. She didn't ask what it meant. It felt more fitting than Evelyn, anyway, a name like a door she no longer walked through. Wapin had taken to showing her things, not with words, but with hands. How to grind berries into powder for dye. How to mend worn hides with sinew, not thread. How to layer furs for warmth. Evelyn fumbled, fingers clumsy, pride bristling. But Wapin's patience wore through her like sun on frost. Each day, a new gesture of welcome appeared. A woven braid of river grass left by her tent. A bundle of firewood stacked neatly when she returned from walking. Once a necklace, rough turquoise strung on rawhide, was pressed into her palm by a small girl with windburned cheeks who disappeared before Evelyn could thank her. There was a boy, too, always just within sight, watching, not with suspicion, but with the stillness of a deer. His name, she learned from Wapin, was Little Elk. His parents had died the year before, taken by settlers during a raid that was never written down in any white man's report. He did not speak, but sometimes he followed Evelyn through the snow, footsteps muffled by moccasins, leaving no trail. One morning, she found a single red feather resting on the stone outside her tent. She looked around and saw no one. But later, by the creek, she saw Little Elk tracing lines in the snow with a stick, and when their eyes met, he did not turn away. The days blurred. She grew used to the taste of ash in her tea, the softness of deer hide against her palms. Her fingers remembered how to work again, not with needles and thread from town, but bone, awls, and patience. She still missed bread. She still missed books. But her heart, long cramped from grief and duty, began to stretch, cautious as a limb long unused. And still, Tahoma kept his distance. Not coldly, not with disdain, but deliberately. Sometimes she watched him train with his warriors, their movements fluid, wild as wind over grass. He moved like someone who belonged to the land. She realized she'd never seen her first husband lift anything heavier than a glass of whiskey, and the thought made her feel nothing. Not shame, not longing, just distance, like remembering a song you used to sing before you understood the words. One afternoon, Tahoma approached her as she scraped ice from the edge of a pot. She stiffened not from fear, but from not knowing what to expect. He held something in his hands, a leather-bound bundle. Inside were thin sheets of bark, pressed and smoothed, covered in marks. He spoke slowly. "Words," he said. "My language." He opened the bundle, pointed to a mark, then said a word. She repeated it, stumbling. "Tao." He nodded. She didn't know what it meant, only that his voice softened when he said it. Each evening after that, he came to her fire, just for a few minutes, always with the bark pages, always with one new word. He did not ask for hers. But once, when she said thank you, he tilted his head and tried to shape the words himself. His mouth formed the sounds gently, like testing a river's current with bare feet. She wanted to ask him why he offered her language instead of affection. But then she realized this was affection. This was invitation. Not possession, not duty, but the sharing of a world. That night she did not sleep easily. Not from fear, but because her heart was too full of questions. And somewhere among them, a flicker of something more dangerous than comfort. Hope. On the 7th morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. Rich, deep, unexpected. It came from the edge of camp, where a group of men had returned from a trade journey. Among them, a settler, white, broad-shouldered, smug. She recognized his hat before his face. Daniel Stroud, a trader, and a man who once asked for her hand before she married her first husband. She turned him down because his smile never reached his eyes. Now his eyes lingered too long. He saw her and smirked. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice oily with amusement. The widow turned chiefess. She said nothing. Wapan stepped closer, and the air grew tight. Tahoma appeared like a shadow cast by flame. He did not touch Evelyn. He did not raise his voice. He said one thing in Comanche, and Stroud laughed nervously. "I come in peace, friend. Just trading." Tahoma's eyes didn't move. Stroud left before the fire died that night. Evelyn sat by her tent alone. Wapan had gone to sleep. The stars above pulsed like cold breath. She held the bark bundle in her lap, fingers brushing the edges of a world still unfamiliar. Tahoma approached, kneeling beside the fire. He stirred the embers once, then met her eyes. "You are not alone," he said, in English this time, each word carved like stone. "Not here." And for the first time, Evelyn believed it. Not because he said it, but because she'd begun to feel it in her bones. That night, as she lay beneath hides, with the wind pushing gently against the tent walls, she whispered one of the words he taught her. Not for him, not for anyone, just for herself. Home. The rain came without warning, thin needles tapping against hide, then gathering into a steady hush that turned the valley to a cradle of sound. It fell soft at first, brushing the camp like a mother's lullaby. Then it thickened, colder, sharper, soaking into every stitch of cloth, every breath. Spring had crept in slow this year, and the thaw brought with it a weight the earth had been holding too long. Evelyn woke to it, coughing, her chest tight and head spinning. The air in her tent tasted of damp leather and ash. Her hands trembled as she reached for the water skin, but even its cool sip did nothing to still the shaking. Wapan found her hunched outside, clutching her arms. The elder woman clicked her tongue and pressed the back of her hand to Evelyn's forehead. No words were exchanged. None were needed. By midday, Tahoma entered the tent for the first time. He ducked through the flap like someone stepping into sacred ground. He didn't speak right away. He knelt beside her, laid down a satchel of herbs and cloth, and unrolled them with careful precision. She wanted to protest, to say she was fine, but her voice failed. Only a whisper came, thin and hoarse. He didn't look at her, only worked. A cup pressed to her lips, steam and bitterness and something warm at the edge of pain. She drank. Later, as the rain beat down harder, she drifted in and out. Fever dreams twisted the edges of the tent. Her first husband's voice, hollow and accusing. Her mother's hands, cold as snow. The sound of a church bell in her ears. But through it all, there was one constant, a presence. Solid, quiet. Someone wiping her brow with a damp cloth. Someone humming a tune she didn't know but trusted. When she woke fully, the light had faded. A small fire crackled just outside the tent. She crawled to the opening, pushing the flap aside. The camp shimmered under silver rain. Everything smelled of wet soil and wood smoke. Tahoma sat near the fire, back straight, shoulders still. He did not see her watching. He was singing. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of song a man sings not to be heard, but because the ache inside him leaves no other choice. It sounded like longing, and something older than grief. A tune passed down through the marrow of memory. She sat quietly, arms around her knees. The song unraveled into silence. "I thought warriors didn't sing," she said, her voice rough. Tahoma didn't startle. He looked over his shoulder, then back to the fire. "I sing for those who cannot," he said. "My father, my wife, my sons." She blinked. "I didn't know." He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "You were not meant to know." She stood slowly, legs shaky. The rain slipped off her shoulders in rivulets, soaking into her cloak. The fire hissed where drops landed. She stepped closer, close enough to see how tired he looked, how much weight he carried beneath the surface. "I lost someone too," she said after a moment. Tahoma looked up. "You lost a man who was not kind." It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "He wasn't." She laughed then. A short, broken sound at first, unexpected, like a window flung open in wind. Then longer. A laugh that doubled her over, that curled through her chest like lightning cracking stone. Not because it was funny, not because she was happy, but because something inside her had finally given way. The dam broke. The ache let go. She laughed because it was rain and fire and grief all at once. Because everything had been too much, too long, and now it all came loose. Tahoma said nothing. When her laughter slowed, softened, he looked at her fully. "Is it pain?" he asked. She wiped at her face, though no tears had fallen. "No. It's the first breath I've taken since he died." The rain gentled. For a long time, they said nothing more, only sat by the fire as the world hushed around them. Later, he brought the bark pages again. She pointed at a symbol, spoke it aloud. "Napahi." He nodded. "It means to begin again." She traced it with her fingertip. "Seems I've done a lot of that." He did not smile, but there was something softer in his silence. In the days that followed, her strength returned. The fever left like a thief, quietly, without apology. Wappen brought her new clothes, stitched with bone buttons and dyed threads. She wore them without thinking, without trying to preserve the last remnants of her former life. Children began to greet her in the mornings. One brought her a carved bird. Another left a shell at her door. Little Elk still followed without speaking, but once she caught him smiling when she fed him a piece of cornbread she'd learned to make over the fire. She found herself humming sometimes. Not songs she knew, just the shapes of them. Sounds that rose without command. Tahoma came each evening, always with a word, always with space. And she began, in her way, to give something back. She told him a story, just one, of the day she left town, of the way no one met her eye, of the wind on her veil, of the silence that followed her out like a ghost. He listened with his whole body, the way someone listens who knows what silence costs. She didn't say the word love. She didn't feel it yet, but she felt seen. And that was a different kind of miracle. On the 10th night after the rain, she stood outside her tent, watching the moon rise. A thin silver arc in a velvet sky. She heard footsteps. Not heavy, not hesitant. Tahoma joined her, said nothing. They stood side by side, the air between them full of everything that didn't need to be spoken. After a while, she turned to him, her voice barely above breath. "Do you still miss them?" His eyes stayed on the stars. "Every day." She nodded. "Me too." There were no promises, no confessions, only the rain that had passed, and the stillness after a storm, where something new begins to grow. The first sign was the rider, dusty, pale-faced, and too fast for a man without cause. He didn't come by the trading route or send word ahead, just appeared like a hawk on the horizon, galloping hard through the valley pass, with a white cloth tied to his rifle. The Comanche spotted him long before he reached the camp. Tahoma met him outside the boundary stones, flanked by 2 scouts, hands empty but ready. Evelyn watched from her tent flap, the pit in her stomach tightening with every hoofbeat. The rider's face came into view, freckled, gaunt, eyes sunken from too many sleepless nights. She knew that look. It was the face of someone carrying news that couldn't be softened. When Tahoma returned, his jaw was locked. He said nothing, but Wapan whispered low, and the camp tensed. Word passed through fires and doorways like wind through dry grass. The mood changed. Softer voices, quicker glances. Something had shifted, and it wasn't weather. Later, Evelyn found Tahoma near the ridge, where he often stood at sunset. The wind pulled at his braid. He didn't look at her when she came near, only nodded once, a gesture worn thin by days that held too much weight. "What was it?" she asked. He was quiet. "Then they built a fort." She blinked. "I thought the treaty." "There was no treaty," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "There was delay. Enough time for the soldiers to dig in, for more to come." The cold moved through her like a ghost. "But our marriage was never meant to last. Not by them." Her breath caught. She staggered backward a step, as if struck. The ground felt unsteady. "They used me. They used us," he said. She looked to the horizon, where the rider had vanished. The fort, she could almost see it in her mind, squat and arrogant, flying flags over promises broken before they were ever spoken. She thought of the men at the wedding, their averted eyes, the loaf of bread, the silence. She'd mistaken it all for pity. It had been something colder. Her hands curled into fists. They never planned peace. Tahoma nodded. They wanted time. Now they have it. The wind was rising. Storm coming, not of clouds, but of men. She turned to him. "What happens now?" "I keep my word," he said, "even if they break theirs." That night, the firelight turned the camp gold and shadowed. Children were sent inside early. Men spoke in low tones. Women prepared food not for comfort, but for travel. Evelyn sat beside her tent, her thoughts a blizzard of memory. She saw her mother's face, her husband's funeral, the bitter looks at her back when she left town, every moment shaped by others' choices. And now, a choice of her own, hovering like thunder behind her ribs. Tahoma found her there, not with questions, just presence. She looked up at him, the firelight making his expression unreadable. "Why did you agree to marry me?" she asked. "If you knew." He sat beside her, slowly, as if setting down something heavy. "Because peace is never given," he said. "It is only chosen, again and again, even when it is not returned." Her throat tightened. "You could have said no." "I saw the way you stood that day," he replied. "No one else moved. You did. That means something." She felt the weight of his words settle into her bones. The pain wasn't just in being used. It was in how easily they had let her go. Not for hate, but for indifference. Her life had been the currency for their delay. Her dignity, a line in a ledger. And he had honored it more than any of them. She turned toward him. "You've never asked anything of me. I never will." She reached for his hand. He did not flinch. For a long time, they stayed like that. Not as enemies. Not as symbols. Just 2 people who'd been bent by history, and chose not to break each other. The next morning, a hawk flew over the camp. Its shadow stretched long across the plain. Evelyn rose before the sun. She braided her hair with fingers steadier than they'd ever been. She wrapped herself in a hide Wappen had gifted, not the cloak she arrived in, but something new, warm, and stitched with care. She stepped outside and saw little Elk by the fire, carving a piece of wood. He looked up at her, nodded once. She returned it. She found Tahoma near the northern ridge again, where the wind came strongest. "They'll come soon," he said. "I know." He looked at her then, truly looked, not as the treaty bride, not as the settler woman, but as someone who had stayed when she could have fled. "You still have time to go." She shook her head. "I don't. They will call you traitor." She smiled bitterly. "They already have." Silence. "Then what will you do?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes traveled the hills, the camp, the sky. "I'll speak." He raised a brow. "They don't fear weapons," she said. "They fear shame. Truth. If they think they can break you without consequence, they will. But if I speak, not as a Comanche wife, but as one of them, they might listen, even if only to save face." "You think that will stop war?" "No," she said. "But maybe it will delay it long enough for them to see what they're about to lose." Tahoma studied her, and then quietly he said, "You are not what they called you." "No," she whispered. "I never was." That night, before the campfire, she practiced her words, not in speeches, but in truths. She spoke to the stars, to the ghosts of her husband and mother, to the child she never had, to the girl she'd once been, meek, obedient, waiting for permission. No more waiting. When she laid down that night, she did not tremble. The fire outside burned low, and the wind carried her breath like a vow, steady, rising, unafraid. The settlers came just after dawn, their wagons creaking like old bones, wheels churning dust made damp by the night's mist. Flags hung limp in the cold morning wind, not fluttering with pride, but sagging with unease. They were not a war party, not yet, but the rifles slung across their shoulders said they could become one before breakfast. Evelyn stood already waiting at the edge of the Comanche camp, the wind twisting her braid against her cheek. She wore the turquoise necklace a child had once left by her tent door. Beneath her cloak, her hands were folded tight at her waist, though no tremble reached her face. Tahoma stood beside her, his arms crossed, his shadow taller than the wagon's flags. From the lead wagon, Reverend Emery climbed down. Not the mayor, not a soldier, a man of words, sent to bury what conscience the others still claimed to carry. His collar was askew, and his eyes darted toward her like she might bite. "Evelyn," he said, voice cautious, "we've come to take you home." She didn't answer. Not right away. She let the silence fill the space between them, the way Tahoma had taught her. "Let it weigh." "I am home," she said at last, soft but without apology. He stepped forward, boots sinking into soft earth. Behind him, soldiers flanked the wagons, half trying to look casual, half itching for a command that would turn conversation into siege. "You're confused," Emery said. "The marriage was a placeholder, nothing more. The situation has changed. The treaty has expired." "That's not what you said before," she replied. Emery cleared his throat. "We understand it's been difficult. We all admire your sacrifice." Her mouth twisted. "Sacrifice," she repeated. "You mean abandonment." A murmur rolled through the Comanche gathered behind her. She didn't look back, but she felt them there, watching, waiting. Tahoma's presence beside her was still as a stone. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. "You were never meant to stay," Emery said. "And if you continue to do so, we can't guarantee your safety." Evelyn stepped forward. Just one pace. Enough to place herself between the Reverend and the line of warriors. Enough to be seen. "You speak of safety," she said. "But not once did you ask what it cost me to leave. Not once did you question why none of your people stepped forward that day. I was a solution to you. A pause in your war plans. A warm body to send in a cold storm. Now listen." "I am listening," she said, sharper now. "I've listened to my husband shout at walls. I've listened to townsfolk whisper when I walked by. I've listened to soldiers plan raids as if children weren't sleeping in the next 10 over. And I've listened to the people you call savages mourn their dead in silence. Emery's face hardened. You've been turned. I've been seen. The words cracked like lightning. I've been more respected in this valley than I ever was under your roof. I was not taken. I was not tricked. I was chosen. And I chose to stay. Gasps and mutters stirred behind the Reverend. The soldiers shifted. One reached for his rifle, uncertain whether words could be fought with. Tahoma finally spoke then, his voice low, measured, but steeped in steel. She stands with us. Harm her, and we do not return to talk. The Reverend looked back at the wagons. The men behind him didn't look sure anymore. They didn't look like they wanted to fight a man who stood still like a mountain and spoke like one. 2. You're one woman, Emery said. What difference do you think this will make? Evelyn took another step forward. Her boots sank in the thawing earth, and she welcomed the weight of it. It makes a difference to me, she said. And that's enough. Her voice was quiet, but it traveled. She stood there with the wind on her back and the man she loved at her side, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was, not someone chosen for a role, not a placeholder, not a sacrifice. Just a woman who had stopped asking for permission to be whole. The Reverend hesitated. He turned to look at his men. Not one stepped forward. Not one lifted a gun. The moment broke not with a bullet, but with retreat. A slow, uncomfortable reversal. The wagons groaned as they turned. No words were exchanged. Just the sound of hoofbeats fading down the trail, swallowed by hills that no longer belonged to them. When the last wheel vanished from sight, Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands unclenched. Tahoma looked at her, and something in his gaze had shifted. Not surprised, not proud, something deeper. Something like recognition. He reached for her hand then. Not in ceremony, not in performance. Just his hand, reaching toward hers like roots seeking familiar ground. She took it. Later, by the fire, little Elk crawled into her lap and fell asleep without a word. Wappen placed a shawl around her shoulders and said nothing, only nodded once. The camp buzzed with stories, all of them folding into one another like threads in a single braid. Evelyn said little. She watched the sky grow dark and the stars claim the heavens one by one. Tahoma sat across from her. He leaned forward. You spoke with fire, he said. I had no more use for silence. He tilted his head. And now, she smiled. Not wide, not bold, just enough to let warmth rise between them. Now I have a voice, and I want to use it to stay. He reached out then, fingertips brushing the curve of her cheek, so light it could have been wind. But she felt it in her bones. They kissed like two trees touching across a river, slow, patient, inevitable. There were no more treaties to sign, no more lies to uncover, only the truth between them. That peace had never been promised. But love had found its way through anyway.